Oh, I thought maybe Guardian fan said something. Okay. Okay, no problem. Jonathan helps David. So, let's see here. I want to make sure I don't have any notes that I'll leave out. Okay, we're going to do a first 10 verses. Then David fled from Naioth in Ramah and went to Jonathan. What have I done? What crime have I committed? What wrong have I done to your father to make him want to kill me? Jonathan answered, God forbid that you should die. My father tells me everything he does, important or not, and he would not hide this from me. It just isn't so. But David answered, your father knows very well how much you like me, and he has decided not to let you know what he plans to do because you would be deeply hurt. I swear to you by the living Lord that I am only a step away from death. Jonathan said, I'll do anything you want. Tomorrow is the new moon festival, and I am supposed to eat with your father the king. But if it's all right with you, I will go and hide in the fields until the evening of the day after tomorrow. If your father notices that I am not on the table, tell him that I begged your permission to hurry home to Bethlehem, since it's the time for the annual sacrifice there for my whole family. If he says, all right, I will be safe. But if he becomes angry, you will know that he is determined to harm me. Please do this favor and keep the sacred promise you made to me. But if I'm guilty, kill me yourself. Why take me into your father to be killed? Don't even think about such a thing, Jonathan answered. If I knew for sure that my father was determined to harm you, wouldn't I tell you? David then said, who will let me know if your father answers you angrily? So David met Jonathan somewhere near Gibeah and wasted no time confronting his beloved friend with the key question. What have I done that is so evil that your father wants to kill me? David had not disobeyed any royal commands or incited any rebellion against the throne or even broken God's law. And yet Saul was bent on destroying him. David knew that Saul was an envious man who wanted to keep the throne for himself and hand it over to his descendants. But David had faith that the Lord would remove Saul from the scene in his good time and in his own way. David dearly loved Jonathan and did not want to hurt him by criticizing his father, but now it was a matter of life and death. Jonathan's reply sounds rather naive, though, especially in the light of Saul's statement, in chapter 19 last time, and his behavior at Ramah. Saul had thrown his spear at David at least twice already, in chapter 18 and in chapter 19, and he has sent 3 groups of soldiers to capture him. And Saul finally went to Ramah himself to do the job. How much evidence did Jonathan need that his father was a disturbed man out to destroy God's anointed king? Jonathan mistakenly thought that his own relationship with his father was closer than it really was, and that Saul would confide in him. But, subsequently, events proved him wrong, for Saul would even try to kill Jonathan. David refuted Jonathan's argument by stating that the logical thing for Saul to do was to keep his eldest son in the dark. Saul knew that David and Jonathan were good friends, and that Jonathan would be pained if he knew Saul's real intentions. The matter was so serious that David could not put his faith in what Saul told Jonathan. There is but one step between me and death, he said in verse 3 right now. This was true both metaphorically and literally, for 3 times David had dodged the king's spear. So Jonathan offered to help in any way his friend suggested, and David proposed a simple test of Saul's true feelings. So it was customary for each Jewish family to hold a feast at the new moon, and Saul would expect David to attend, of course. If Saul's son-in-law David and leading military hero did not attend the feast, it would be an insult to the king as well as the family. So David's absence would help reveal Saul's genuine attitude toward David. If Saul became angry, then David's assessment was correct. But if Saul excused David and did not press the matter, then Jonathan was correct. The only problem with this scheme was that it required Jonathan to lie by saying that David had gone to Bethlehem to attend his own family feast. David would be hiding in the field and waiting for Jonathan to tell him whether or not it was safe to come home. Let's continue, verse 11. "Let's go out to the fields," Jonathan answered. So they went. And Jonathan said to David, "May the Lord God of Israel be our witness. At this time tomorrow and on the following day, I will question my father. If his attitude toward you is good, I will send you word. If he intends to harm you, may the Lord strike me dead if I don't let you know about it and get you safely away. May the Lord be with you as he was with my father. And if I remain alive, please keep your sacred promise and be loyal to me. But if I die, show the same kind of loyalty to my family forever. And when the Lord has completely destroyed all your enemies, may our promise to each other still be unbroken. If it is broken, the Lord will punish you." First things first, this little promise that Jonathan made David commit to, I'll even go back and read it. It's an interesting story. Let me just read this real quick. This is Jonathan telling David, okay? "And if I remain alive, please keep your sacred promise and be loyal to me." So Jonathan is asking David to, remain loyal to Jonathan, to him, right? But look at this. "But if I die, show the same kind of loyalty to my family forever." What does this mean? Well, eventually you know that Saul and Jonathan are going to be killed in action, right? But Jonathan already has kids. I told you the other day that Jonathan is a lot older than David. So Jonathan already has kids. In fact, one of them is called Mephibosheth. And then eventually Mephibosheth's nurse or caregiver ends up dropping him on the floor and he becomes disabled. So he needs always 24/7 care. Mephibosheth does. So when Jonathan is gone, when he passed away, David remembered his promise to Jonathan to take care of his family. And he remembered that Mephibosheth was the one that David always decided to take care of. Okay. Once again, Jonathan made David promise to love him, for Jonathan loved David as much as he loved himself. So David is silent while Jonathan reviews the covenant they had made with each other. Jonathan even took an oath and promised to give David the correct message on the third day of the feast, so he would know whether the king was friendly or not. Jonathan went beyond the immediate crisis to deal with future events. He knew that David would one day become king, and he prayed that the Lord would bless his reign, David's reign. In their covenant, they agreed that Jonathan would serve next to David as second in command. Chapter 23. And now Jonathan asked that if anything happened to him, David would promise not to wipe out his household, and David agreed. The phrase, "the kindness of the Lord," in verse 14, shows up in 2 Samuel chapter 9, where David's compassionate care of Jonathan's crippled son, Mephibosheth, is described. So Jonathan reaffirmed his oath and included the whole house of David. And he asked David to repeat his covenant oath as well. Now, there's no mention of the offering of a covenant sacrifice in this covenant because the love of the two men they were best of friends. They made each other word sufficient. They didn't need to make any other covenant. So let's continue now. Then Jonathan said to him, "Since tomorrow is the new moon festival, your absence will be noticed if you are not at the meal. The day after tomorrow, your absence will be noticed even more. So go to the place where you hid yourself the other time and hide behind the pile of stones there. I will then shoot 3 arrows at it as though it were a target. Then I will tell my servant to go and find them. If I tell him, look, the arrows are on this side of you, get them. This means that you are safe and can come out. I swear by the living Lord that you will be in no danger. But if I tell him the arrows are on the other side of you, then leave, because the Lord is sending you away. As for the promise we have made to each other, the Lord will make sure that we keep it forever. Okay, let's see here. I want to make sure. So David hid in the fields at the new moon festival. King Saul came to the meal and sat in his usual place by the wall. Abner sat next to him, and Jonathan sat across the table from him. Now, pause. Important pause. There's going to be a couple of statements in the next couple of paragraphs, and then in the next chapter, that they're changed a little bit in this translation of the Bible. But I will tell you what it is and what the other translation says. It's more like an insult. I'll show it to you when it comes to it. And so Abner sat next to him, next to Saul, and Jonathan sat across the table from him. David's place was empty, but Saul said nothing that day, because he thought something has happened to him, and he is not ritually pure. How do people become ritually impure? Well, obviously, if David would have touched a dead body of an animal, a carcass, or had sex with with his wife, then that would make him ritually unclean, and he would have to go and bathe and put on new clothes and wait 24 hours. So that's basically why somebody will become ritually impure to attend this kind of festival. On the following day, the day after the new moon festival, David's place was still empty. And Saul said to Jonathan, why didn't David come to the meal either yesterday or today? That is not what King Saul said. King Saul said, why didn't the son of Jesse come to the meal either yesterday or today? The son of Jesse. The son of Jesse. What's the big deal, you saying? Well, in those days, it was almost like an insult. Like, example, if your name is Johnny and your mother is Martha, and I wanted to insult you, Johnny, I would say, you son of Martha. Doesn't sound like an insult to us, but in those days, it was an insult to call somebody by the name of their father's sibling or their mother's sibling. So that's why it says, why didn't David come to the meal either yesterday or today? Technically it says, why didn't Jesse's son or the son of Jesse come to the meal either yesterday or today? Like basically disrespecting David himself by not even mentioning his name. Jonathan answered, he begged me to let him go to Bethlehem. Please let me go, he said, because our family is celebrating the sacrificial feast in town, and my brother ordered me to be there. So then if you are my friend, let me go and see my relatives. That is why he isn't in his place at your table. So constantly afraid of personal attacks, Saul sat with his back to the wall. Did you notice that? Saul, I told you the other day that Saul suffered from a few different things. Schizophrenia, paranoia, and bipolar illness. And he was always paranoid. That's why he always sat with his back against the wall, so nobody would grab him from the back. That's just the way Saul was. But let's continue. So Abner sat next to him. Remember, Saul was with his back to the wall. Abner was next to him, and Jonathan was across from his father. David's place next to Jonathan was empty, but the king said nothing about it. Convinced that David was ceremonially unclean and therefore unable to eat a holy feast that day, the feast consisted primarily of meat from the new moon the new moon fellowship offering, and anyone ceremonially unclean was prohibited from participating. Perhaps David had touched something unclean, or he may have had intercourse with his wife. It doesn't really matter. If so, all that he had to do was separate himself from other people for that day, bathe his body, and change clothes, and he could come back into society the next day. But anyways, but when the men met for their meal the second day, again David was missing, which suggested to Saul that his son-in-law's absence was caused by something more serious than simple ritual defilement. An unclean person could remove the defilement in a day. But David had been missing for 2 days now. Suspicious of anything out of the ordinary in his official staff, Saul asked Jonathan why David was absent, disdainfully, like I said, calling him the son of Jesse, rather than by his given name that was now so famous. Later, Saul would try to humiliate the high priest Ahimelech by calling him, "You son of Ahitub," the son of his father. This is going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 22. So at this point, Jonathan dropped his lie into the conversation, and nothing went right after that. Jonathan did not say that David's father Jesse had summoned him home, but that one of his brothers had commanded him to attend the family feast. So perhaps Jonathan hoped his father would assume that the invitation came from one of David's 3 brothers. Let's continue. Saul became furious with Jonathan and said to him, "How rebellious and faithless your mother was. Now I know you are taking sides with David." You notice here again how Saul is now talking smack about his own wife, Jonathan's mom. Those were characters in those days. How rebellious and faithless your mother was. Now I know you are taking sides with David and are disgracing yourself and that mother of yours. Don't you realize that as long as David is alive, you will never be king of this country? Now go and bring him here. He must die. Why should he die? Jonathan replied. What has he done? At that, Saul threw his spear at Jonathan, yes, his own son, to kill him. And Jonathan realized that his father was really determined to kill David. Jonathan got up from the table in a rage and ate nothing that day. The second day of the new festival, he was deeply distressed about David because Saul had insulted him. So when hateful feelings are in the heart, it doesn't take much for angry words to come out of the mouth. We just read that in today's devotional. Saul had probably been brooding over how David had insulted him by refusing to attend the feast, and the longer he brooded, the more the fire raged within him. But instead of attacking David, King Saul attacked his own son. Had the Lord not intervened back in Ramah, Saul would have been killed. Saul would have killed David in the very presence of the prophet Samuel. And now Saul, reviled his own son while eating a holy feast. Now, like I said before, the king's tirade seems to disparage his own wife. But rightly understood, his words describe his son as the lowest of the low. According to Saul, Jonathan's treachery in befriending David indicated that he was not Saul's son at all, but the son of another man. For a son of Saul would never betray his own father, him. Therefore, Jonathan was slandering his own mother and saying she was a common prostitute, a rebel against the law of Moses, and a woman who practiced perversion. So, because Jonathan helped David and did not protect his father's throne, he had shamed his mother as much as if he had exposed her nakedness. She bore him to be the successor to his father, and now Jonathan had refused the crown in favor of the son of Jesse. The king was shouting, "You are no son of mine. You must be illegitimate." Saul's great concern was the preservation of the kingdom that the Lord had already taken away from him. God had made it very clear that none of Saul's sons would ever inherit the throne. and David was the king of God's choice. So Saul was fighting the will of God and asking Jonathan to do the same. Saul was aware that his son knew where David was hiding and commanded Jonathan to find David and bring him to be killed. When Jonathan demonstrated with his father how he really felt and refused to obey the royal command, Saul threw his spear at his own son. So Jonathan left the table in anger and spent the rest of the day fasting. 35. The following morning, Jonathan went to the fields to meet David, as they had agreed. He took a young boy with him and said to him, "Run and find the arrows that I'm going to shoot." The boy ran, and Jonathan shot an arrow beyond him. When the boy reached the place where the arrow had fallen, Jonathan then shouted to him, "The arrow is farther on. Don't just stand there, hurry up." The boy picked up the arrow and returned to his master, not knowing what it all meant. Only Jonathan and David knew. Jonathan gave his weapons to the boy and told him to take them back to town. After the boy had left, David got up from behind the pile of stones, fell on his knees, and bowed with his face to the ground 3 times. Both he and Jonathan were crying as they kissed each other. David's grief was even greater than Jonathan's. Then Jonathan said to David, "God be with you. The Lord will make sure that you and I, and your descendants and mine, will forever keep the sacred promise we have made to each other." Then David left, and Jonathan went back to the town. Okay, so Jonathan waited until the next day and then went out into the field with one of his young attendants, as though he were going to practice shooting arrows. As he promised David, he shot 3 arrows, one of which was sent far beyond the boy, making it necessary for Jonathan to shout to the boy. But his words were meant for David's ears. "Hurry, go quickly, don't linger." When the boy came back with the arrows, Jonathan gave him the bow and sent him back to the city, and then he ran out to meet David. Now, this was not their last meeting. The last meeting was going to be in chapter 23. But it was certainly a profound emotional farewell. Now, something important to note here. They both wept, but David wept the most. He didn't know how many years of exile lay before him, and perhaps he might never see his beloved friend again. Now, Eastern people are not ashamed to cry, embrace, and kiss one another when they meet or when they part. Eastern people. This is in Genesis 31, verse 55, and Acts chapter 20, verse 37. Jonathan saying, "Go in peace," must have encouraged David. Both men reaffirmed their covenant, knowing that the Lord heard their words and saw their hearts. So David left and traveled 3 miles to the priestly city of Nob. Some bad stuff is going to happen in Nob. You'll read about this in the next chapter. And Jonathan returned to Gibeah and continued to be an officer in his father's army. 10 years later, the Philistines would kill Saul, Jonathan, and his brothers in the battlefield. 10 years later. So this right here is the beginning of David's running away from Saul. It's going to be about 10 years of running away. But this is the period where David wrote a lot of his Psalms. We'll cover which ones in a little bit. In fact, chapter 21. Now, let me tell you something, what's going to happen here. There's a few things that I want you to capture and glean from what I'm going to say. When David went to this town called Nob, we're going to read about this next, it marked the beginning of an exile that lasted about 10 years. From chapter 21 of 1 Samuel to chapter 29 of 1 Samuel. Not all of David's wilderness experiences are recorded, though, but enough history has been given to show that he was a man of faith and courage. While it is difficult to determine the background of every psalm, it is likely that David's fugitive years are reflected in Psalms 7, 11, 12, 13, 16, 17, 22, 25, 31, 34, 35, 52, 53, 54, 56, 57, 58, 59, 63, 64, 142, 143. Now, Psalm 18 is his song of praise when God gave him triumph over his enemies. It is wonderful that David wrote so many encouraging psalms during this period of great suffering. And from them, God's people today can find strength and courage in their own times of testing. Even our Lord Jesus Christ quoted Psalm 22 and Psalm 31 when he was on the cross. So let's read about this adventure in Nob and see what a horrible, disgusting thing happens. David went to the priest Ahimelech in Nob. Ahimelech came out trembling to meet him and asked, "Why did you come here all by yourself?" "I'm here on the king's business," David answered. "He told me not to let anyone know what he sent me to do. As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what supplies do you have? Give me 5 loaves of bread or anything else you have." The priest said, "I don't have any ordinary bread, only sacred bread. You can have it if your men have not had any sexual relations recently." David answered, "Of course they haven't. My men always keep themselves ritually pure, even when we go out on an ordinary mission. How much more this time when we are on a special mission?" So the priest gave David the sacred bread, because the only bread he had was the loaves offered to God, which had been removed from the sacred table and replaced with fresh bread. Now check this out. Saul, remember, Saul does not like David. Saul's chief herdsman, Doeg, who was from Edom, happened to be there that day because he had to fulfill a religious obligation. David said to Ahimelech, "Do you have a spear or a sword you can give me?" "The king orders made me leave in such a hurry that I didn't have time to get my sword or any other weapon." Ahimelech answered, "I have the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in Elah Valley. It is behind the ephod, wrapped in a cloth. If you want it, take it. It's the only weapon here." "Give it to me," David said. "There is not a better sword anywhere." Now, before we go on to what happens, it's going to be in the next chapter, which we're going to read in a second. Let me explain something. This town of Nob was 3 miles south of Gibeah, where the tabernacle was located. Okay? Because of his friendship with Samuel, David knew that he would find refuge and help among the priests there. It was a Levitical town. There was a lot of priests living there. And that's what makes the thing really disgusting, what happens in the next chapter. And he had a strong personal devotion to the sanctuary of the Lord. The fact that David arrived alone frightened Ahimelech, the high priest, who was the great-grandson of Eli and was also known as Ahiah. He knew David's reputation and position and wondered that he was traveling without a royal entourage. Now, if the king, quote unquote, in verse 2 refers to the Lord Jehovah, then David is not lying when he says he's on a mission for the king. For David certainly was doing the Lord's business and will be for the rest of his life. But this statement is a deliberate lie. If it was, then David was scheming instead of trusting. His motive was probably to protect the high priest from Saul's future investigation, but the plan failed, for Saul killed Ahimelech and all the priests except Abiathar because they conspired with his enemy. We're going to read about that in the next chapter. However, it is possible that David had asked some of his men to rendezvous with him at the cave in Adullam. So David's reference to the ritual purity of his men suggests this. David needed food, so Ahimelech gave him the sacred loaves from the tabernacle, the food that was reserved only for the priest. And this is also In Matthew chapter 12 and Mark chapter 2 and Luke chapter 6, how David took the bread that was offered at the showbread in the tabernacle. Anyways, let's read what happens here. So David left fleeing from Saul and went to King Achish of Gath. Remember, this is Philistine territory now. Philistines, okay? King Achish of Gath. The king's officials said to Achish, "Isn't this David, the king of his country? This is a man about whom the women sing as they dance. Saul has killed thousands, but David has killed tens of thousands." Their words made a deep impression on David, and he became very much afraid of King Achish. So whenever David was around them, he pretended to be insane and acted like a madman when they tried to restrain him. He would scribble on the city gates and let spit drool down his beard. So Achish said to his officials, "Look, the man is crazy. Why did you bring him to me? Don't I have enough madmen already? Why bring another one to bother me with his crazy actions right here in my own house?" Interesting. Let's go to this one here. We're going to go at least, we can read it real quick. Chapter 22, the slaughter of the priests. David fled from the city of Gath and went to a cave near the town of Adullam. When his brothers and the rest of the family heard that he was there, they joined him. People who were oppressed or in debt or dissatisfied went to him, about 400 men in all, and he became their leader. Notice that even David's own brothers, who were kind of hating on him before, now they're part of his crew. So David went on from there to Mizpah in Moab and said to the king of Moab, "Please let my father and mother come and stay with you until I find out what God is going to do for me." So David left his parents with the king of Moab, and they stayed there as long as David was hiding out in the cave. Remember, Moab at first, in the olden days and Joshua's days, they weren't really very, very keen with the Israelites. But remember Ruth? She was a Moabite, and Ruth was actually David's grandmother. Then the prophet Gad came to David and said, "Don't stay here. Go at once to the land of Judah." So David left and went to the forest of Hereth. One day Saul was in Gibeah, sitting under a tamarisk tree on a hill, with a spear in his hand, and all his officers were standing around him. He was told that David and his men had been located, and he said to his officers, "Listen, men of Benjamin, do you think that David will give fields and vineyards to all of you and make you officers in his army? Is that why you are plotting against me?" See, he's always paranoid, even with his own men. "Not one of you told me that my own son had made an alliance with David. No one is concerned about me or tells me that David, one of my own men, is right now looking for a chance to kill me." David doesn't want to kill him. David still respects and loves him. Saul is the one who wants to kill David. So he's delusional as well. And that my own son has encouraged him? Now here we go. Remember I told you to listen to the city of Nob, that little village of Nob? Doeg was standing there with Saul's officers. And he said, "I saw David when he went to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, in Nob." Ahimelech asked the Lord what David should do, and then he gave David some food and the sword of Goliath, the Philistine. So King Saul sent for the priest Ahimelech and all his relatives, who were also priests in Nob, and they came to him. Saul said to Ahimelech, "Listen, Ahimelech." Right here, same thing. It says, "Listen, Ahimelech," right? But another translation says, "Listen, you son of Ahitub, you son of your father." "At your service, sir," he answered. Saul asked him, "Why are you and David plotting against me? Why did you give him some food and a sword and consult God for him? Now he has turned against me and is waiting for a chance to kill me." Ahimelech answered, "David is the most faithful officer you have. He is your own son-in-law, captain of your bodyguard, and highly respected by everyone in the royal court. Yes, I consulted God for him, and it wasn't the first time. As for plotting against you, your majesty must not accuse me or anyone else in my family. I don't know anything about this matter. The king said, Ahimelech, you and all your relatives must die. Then he said to the guards standing near him, kill the Lord's priests. They conspired with David and did not tell me that he had run away, even though they knew it all along. But the guards refused to lift a hand to kill the Lord's priests. I mean, they were smart. But guess what? Look what happens. So Saul said to Doeg, you'll kill them. And Doeg killed them all. On that day he killed 85 priests who were qualified to carry the ephod. Saul also had all the other inhabitants of Nob, the city of priests, put to death. Men, women, children, babies, cattle, donkeys, and sheep. They were all killed. But Abiathar, one of Ahimelech's sons, escaped and went and joined David. He told him how Saul had slaughtered the priests of the Lord. David said to him, when I saw Doeg there that day, I knew that he would be sure to tell Saul. So I am responsible for the death of all your relatives. Stay with me and do not be afraid. Saul wants to kill both you and me, but you will be safe with me. So what we have here, let me cover a couple of things here. Let's see, anything here? So fear of Saul now temporarily replaced faith in the Lord. And David fled 23 miles to the enemy city of Gath. This is the home of the Philistine giant Goliath. Remember I told you it's the Philistine area? It wasn't a safe place to go, but after seeing Doeg at Nob, David must have decided that his presence anywhere in Israel would only jeopardize the lives of his friends. So he decided to leave the land. And furthermore, the last place Saul would look for him would be in the Philistine area. David's reputation as a great warrior had preceded him, and the king and his counselors did not view his presence as a blessing. David then pretended to be mad, crazy, drooling from his mouth and stuff like that. And this made it easy for him to escape unharmed. So just to let you know, Psalm 34 and Psalm 56 both came out of this bizarre experience. Psalm 56 was his prayer for God's help when the situation became dangerous. And Psalm 34 was his hymn of praise after God had delivered him. Although he mentions fear in verse 4 and 7 and deliverance from trouble, verse 6, 17, and 19, the emphasis in Psalm 56 is on the slander and verbal attacks of the Philistine leaders as they try to get their king to deal with David. So that is what's going on right there. Let me see. Yeah, this thing about Doeg, I want to mention. When we covered chapter 21, last chapter in verse 7, people realized, why was this character named Doeg mentioned? So now we discover why Doeg was mentioned. For now he steps forward as a key actor in the drama that we just read. Wherever there is a scheming leader, he will have scheming followers, for we reproduce after our own kind. Now there are people who will do anything to gain the leader's approval and receive his rewards. And this guy Doeg was such a man. This was the perfect time for him to use his knowledge to please the king and raise his own stature before the other officers. The fact that he was accusing God's anointed king did not bother him, or that he lied about what the high priest said and did. It's no wonder that David despised Doeg and expressed his loathing in the words of Psalm 52. Amen. We're done for right now. Let me see.